Hi, it's Juliet. Welcome to my studio. So for tools for the rocket bead, there's not a whole lot you need. We'll be shaping the base rocket. You can use gravity. If you have a marvering pad, either on your torch or a separate marvering pad, graphite, brass, whatever you're comfortable with, you can use that. I also sometimes marver on a handheld thing like a magic wand from Karina Tools. If you're going to do raking, you'll need something pointy to rake with. I like the poker. Or you can use just a cheap razor blade knife. I got this one from the dollar shop years ago. It's been well loved. Um, Sometimes it's handy to have a little dental tool like this to kind of tap and push things down. You know, I keep my basic tweezers around, but really there isn't a whole lot of specialized tools that you need for this. In terms of glass, hey, that can be any color you want. For the bead I'm going to demonstrate, I'm going to use a blue body for the rocket. I'll probably use some white stringers and I'll show you the raking technique. And then I'm going to use some red for the rocket engines on the back end, maybe a little bit of yellow for the fins and some portholes. But you can use any colors you want. I have a collection of twisties and stringers on my workbench, so I'll just, grab whatever the mood strikes at the time when I'm ready to add more details. So let's get started in a moment. If you're using a cigarette lighter like I am, make sure you store it someplace safe away from flying hot glass because it can explode. Mine's in a drawer underneath my workbench, so it's out of the way. All right, so Beads of Courage likes to have the larger mandrels because they're easier for the kids to string, but that's not a strict requirement. I like to pre-polish my mandrels, especially if there's any big gritty bits. I'll kind of polish them out. It'll make it easier to get the bead off, especially if you're using a transparent. It makes it a little bit more clear because you don't have as much, I don't know, frosted look. You don't have cavities to clean out. So preheat my mandrel. I'm going to use the blue base for the rocket. And I'm going to just wind on. I'm going to make it sort of conical shape with the skinny end on the left and the wider end on the right. I'm right-handed, and so I want to put the wider end where I have a lot more of the details like the tails and the flames because it's easier to actually physically get at that side of the bead. So I'm going to wind on my base bead. It's about as long as I'm going to have it. You can make these as big as you'd like. You can tell there was a section there where I had a little bit of an air bubble. I probably didn't preheat my bead release quite enough, so we'll go in and another dot there, and let me finish up my back end. So I've got a nice bead pucker. So I'm not going to marver it at this point because I want to build it up into a conical shape. So I'm just going to work on adding glass. While you're adding glass, if you rotate the glass rod and you're heating it from all sides, it'll kind of heat through a little bit faster, so it goes a little bit faster. So at this point I'm just going to use my tool and smooth it out in a bit of a conical shape. A little bit more heat up front here. The front part smoothed out. We'll be raking and adding more designs to it at this point, so it's not super critical that it's perfect. You want to make sure you do have nice bead ends. And make sure when you clean your beads, you check that there's no sharp edges at the bead holes, because those could hurt the children, and we definitely don't want that. If you need to, you can always kind of grind down any sharp edges before you send them in. And ground edges are perfectly acceptable. Just, just make sure there's nothing sharp there. Okay, so there's my conical shape for my rocket. And so I think next I am going to build up using a red stringer where the flame is going to be coming out on the bottom end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my commercial stringer. You could use a full rod, it's just a little trickier. or you could use hand-pulled stringer. This is probably about 3 millimeters or so. And I am essentially winding on a small bead just right past the end of the blue body. And then I'm going to marver that a little bit. You want to keep the rest of the bead warm. The tip of the rocket is thin, so it will cool off quickly, so you got to kind of be mindful of that. So I'm just marvering the business end of the rocket, the flame end of the rocket. I'll take an orange color actually and add just a couple of swipes of some different colors to make it look a little more interesting down there. So you could use another color, red or maybe yellow or orange. This is a slightly different shade of red. I'm just going to swipe on just a few swipes here just to give it a little bit of a variety since flames aren't generally a solid color. Just adding just a few little swipes around the end to give it a little bit extra detail. Okay, so we'll let that kind of cool off and melt in a bit. I'm taking one of the stringers I pulled beforehand. This is just plain old Fetri white. What I'm going to do is coil it around down the length of the body, and then I'm going to rake it. So what I do is I want to have my bead pre-warmed so it will accept the stringer nicely. And I'm going to touch the tip of my stringer into the flame to get it hot and touch it down up near the point of the rocket. And I am below and to the right of the flame. I'm sort of, occasionally I may dip up into the flame to pre-warm the stringer. And I'm slowly turning the bead. The bead is completely below the flame. And my white stringer is just off to the right edge of it. And I'm just kind of winding this around down to the end. So now the next step is to melt that in. And sometimes where you begin and end, those little edges can easily pick off or melt off or pop off. They jump off sometimes. So you want to kind of heat those and make sure they're pushed down. And now we're going to slowly melt it in. We kind of coax it along a little bit with our marvering pad, or you can use the backside of a stump shaper, or whatever your tool of choice is, your desktop marver, or your torch-top marver if you have one of those. But we want to melt those in and get them flat, just about there. I'm going to get the one on the bottom a little bit more. Okay, that's pretty good. So now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rake it down, and then I'm going to rake it down in 4 quadrants along the rocket. So I'm going to heat top to bottom in the area where I'm going to rake, and I'm going to just slightly drag down in there. Now, I like to rake a little bit and then rake a little bit more and then a little bit more. I think it gives me a little bit more of a controlled, changing in the lines. And after we've got it raked down, what we're going to do is melt it in. So now I'm going to go to the opposite side of the bead. So that raking is there, so I'm going to go to the exact opposite side of the bead and basically repeat this. So I'm going to kind of pre-warm the whole area, then I'm going to start at the top. And I'm not putting my rake into the flame. I'm preheating just like the surface millimeter or so of the glass. And I'm just dragging that glass down. You can see it makes those neat dragging lines in the white. So now I'm going to go halfway in between those two. So I'm going to kind of preheat that section. All right, so now we have these 4 rakes down the length of my rocket. So the requirements for this to have a place for the passenger, so obviously that's the rocket. We need to have a propulsion force, so that would be like the flames coming out the back end here. And then we need to add some other details. So I think what I'm going to do is add a few portholes. And I'll just make those some nice dots going down the length of the rocket. I'll put 3 of them here. 1, 2, 3. And I'm using a commercial stringer in yellow. You can use a hand-pulled stringer or anything else you'd like. So we could leave those dots as is. We could flatten them out. At this point, if you want to add or subtract glass to make them about the same size, you can do that. Like that last one, I want to add just another smidge of glass because it's smaller than the other ones. If you didn't get them exactly in the right place as you're melting and flattening them, you can kind of nudge it one way or the other and correct things. You can also add another detail by taking a kind of a blunt poker and heating up a dot and pushing it in the center, and that makes, you know, sort of like a little dimple in the middle of the dot, which is sort of an interesting detail. You can make stacked dots or anything else you like too. Okay, so those are yellow, and now I think I'm gonna use the yellow again and make some fins that are, you know, for control surfaces down the side of the rocket. So I'm gonna put the fins, like 3 of them around the edge of the rocket. So I'll put one on either side of my porthole windows and then one on the back side. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna heat up the end of a stringer, push it down, and then swipe down towards the end and melt it off. You want to get that melted in. What we're going to be doing is just basically swiping down and building it up. Swipe down and build it up, and then melt it in a little bit. Okay, so now let's let that one cool a bit. Let's do one on the other side of these little porthole dots. So we will do swipe down and pull it off. That melt in a bit. Swipe down and pull it off. Now you can, with each swipe, start just a little bit further down it, and that sort of builds it up so it gets a little bit thicker down towards the bottom end. So there are 2 fins. Let's put a 3rd fin on the back here. So swipe down, pull it off, make sure it's melted in well. Let's warm up the tip and the other thing while that's cooling a bit. Let's add another swipe down this guy. All right, that's pretty good. At this point, you know, aerodynamically, you want to make sure your rocket's going to go straight so you can straighten your fins out. You want to make sure that they're on there really good and secure. You don't want them breaking off for the kids. Remember, these things are going to take a little bit of a rough handling. So make sure things are melted in real good. You could add other details at this point. You know, we could put a little bit of yellow on the bottom, just on the edges of the dots where I've got my flames coming out. So melt those in. If during your raking it gets a little thin, you can always add a wrap of glass around it at this point. I may do that because it looked a little thin up there. Just add a little bit of glass. That way the rocket on the nose, it can get a little thin, and when you're taking it off the mandrel and cleaning the bead release, it can get sharp there. So if you have a little bit of extra glass, that'll give you a nicer bead pucker. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat that up, hold it at an angle, and then I'm actually going to hold it like straight up and down and let gravity kind of pull that down. And if you want to, you can take your marvering tool and kind of just touch on that a little bit. A bit of heat in the back end here. Don't let that get too hot. Smooth that out just a little bit there. All right, so we should have a good bead hole here up in the nose cone of the rocket. All right, let's give it a little bit of insurance heat. Make sure our fins are melted on real well. There are no sharp edges. And our bead holes are going to look good. And there we have a cute little rocket for the kids.
Thank you so much for subscribing, and don't forget to check out the rest of the playlist on all of our Beads of Courage transportation series. There's everything from airplanes to cars to sailboats to hot air balloons, flying saucers. And I know you guys are going to have as much fun making these as we did creating the tutorials. Thanks for supporting Beads of Courage, and have fun!